Well, tell us a little bit more about just the general social environment and being associated with the military and a military base during that era. What was it like
Well,
growing?
during the war, I worked there, and I worked for Quartermaster Corps. And the most interesting story I have about that is finding a locomotive on base. We had to do an inventory, and I had paperwork for 2 locomotives. And I went to Colonel Mueller and said, I don't understand this. And he said, we only have 1 locomotive. I finally found that when the locomotive came on base, it was to cart people back and forth to Mount Clemens. Particularly the enlisted personnel during the war didn't come with cars and stuff. And when they did an inventory 2 years after it got there, they couldn't find the locomotive papers. It had been picked up in engineering equipment, and they apparently didn't look there. So my support for it was found on base. And so I wrote it off as lost on base. And we wound up with 1 locomotive. That's my favorite memory of the Quartermaster Corps.
Okay.
That and the fact that we had a sergeant who was from Colonel Mueller's hometown. And he was very, very capable. He ran the warehouse, and he was very capable, much more so than some of the people that shipped stuff in, because we got 2 shipments of Arctic clothing, which we needed at Selfridge like another hole.
I don't doubt.
Well,
go ahead.
Selfridge was, it was kind of transitional. During the war, there were very few airplanes there. People shipped in and shipped out. I did get to see a B-26. They couldn't get a B-29 in. Our runways were not long enough. But then after the war, they had the F-80s there. And that was when I dated people out at Selfridge. And I remember when they finally built new quarters. They have all brick quarters now, and a lot of them face Lake St. Clair. It's a pretty well, I guess it's a pretty base. I haven't been back since 1950.
Well, let's go back a moment and talk about the period when you were an instructor. I think that's fascinating. And so you actually encountered young men who had already served as pilots.
Oh, yes.
And so what was their attitude when you approached them? That was probably somewhat awkward, wasn't it?
No, they were pretty good. I was only 26.
Okay.
And most of them were about that age. And it was, I think at first they thought it was kind of funny, but then we had a sergeant who was a chief mechanic who was in the class. He was getting a pilot's license. He had never had a pilot's license. And he helped me tremendously because if there was anything I wasn't sure of about engines, I'd just say, Smokey, what can you tell the boys about so-and-so? Because I hadn't studied a lot about the circular engines. I had done mostly the opposed engines, and that was all I had ever rebuilt. But I did have fun with our chief mechanic one time. I had finished rebuilding an engine, and he was working on another one, and I went over to his engine stand and took a handful of nuts and bolts, and I said, I finished that, Johnny, but I've got these left over. And
what did he say?
He was not very pleased with me for a moment. But it turned out the engine was all right. He inspected it.
Just spare
parts. I got to do the weight and damage reports. We put all our planes on skis in the wintertime. Right. Not at the Air Force, but at the little airport where I worked. And, of course, everything had to be filed with the aeronautics people when you changed anything about the weight balance on an airplane. So I got to do all those. And I learned a lot of which I've forgotten, but I'm learning again. George is helping me with the Air Force books and magazine.
That's commendable. We admire you for that.
Because I had no idea of how it has developed in the cargo planes that they have now. I remember when they built the C-5 here. Right. But I didn't know much about them, and I knew nothing about the refueling, which is very interesting.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any general thoughts about aviation as it's emerged as public policy? Obviously, most people know that in 1947 that the United States Air Force was created as a separate military component with legislation that was signed by President Truman.
Right.
And within that legislation, the Air National Guard was also created. And of course, two of the icons that you talked about emerged during that period as leaders of the newly found Air Force, being General LeMay and General Spots. Do you have any
Yes.
memories or observations about that period?
I remember General Spots' name, but I don't even have a vague memory of what he looked like. And I do remember what Jimmy Doolittle looked like. But I've always been, of course, the boys and I used to talk about there ought to be a separate Air Force.
Right.
It's not right for the Air Force to be part of the Army. They ought to both do their own job. But then, of course, now that's so different because the Army uses so many helicopters.
That's true.
And stuff, and I'm very interested in that. I have friends whose son just graduated from helicopter school, and he's flying is it called the Cherokee or something? It's a great big one that they
Chinook, I
Chinook.
think. Yeah, that's it.
I don't know why I thought Cherokee, but it's a
Close.
Chinook. He's flying Chinooks.
Right.
And that was very interesting. And I talked to him a couple of days after he had after he had soloed his first thing. And I didn't realize at the time that he was doing helicopters, but it made me remember when I soloed. My instructor got out. I stopped. He got out and looked at me and said, "For God's sakes, let me out of here and take it away."
Do you have any thoughts or comments about the National Guard and the Reserve, because it's obviously become more and more of a vital element to our military's mission?
Oh, I'm sure it has, because I have worked with a young man at Budget who serves in the National Guard. Now, he's not in the Air National Guard.
Right.
And I would be interested in knowing more about that, because I think it's important to have people who are trained who don't have time for a total military career, but are trained and can be called in when needed.
Absolutely.
And this young man has been to Afghanistan, and his name is Daryl Holloman. And he's been to, I think, Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the place in the Middle East, Bosnia. I know he was there for quite a while. And I think it's wonderful for young people to give up their time to do that. And my boss is very good about supporting anyone who is in the National Guard or Air National Guard. They get their time off and their job back when they come back.
It's indeed a blessing to have an employer that is that understanding.
Well, it's a blessing to have an employer who would hire an 87-year-old in the first place.
Well, let me ask you then, what's your secret to your vitality and your positive outlook on life? Can you share a few words of wisdom with us?
I eat breakfast.
Is that the secret? You eat breakfast every morning?
It's funny. I think it really partly is because my father insisted on it, and breakfast is my favorite meal. Mm-hmm. But life is pretty wonderful. A lot of us don't realize it until we're around somebody who's very ill. Mm-hmm. But I feel good. I have aches and pains occasionally. I've always had pets. I've always had somebody to look after. I have no children of my own, but I have 2 sets of stepchildren that I'm very close to. And it's funny, none of them have any interest in Army, Navy, Air Force, or anything else. Mm-hmm. I have a nephew who served 20 years as a naval officer, and I'll have to tell him about being out here.
Please do. It's been our pleasure.
He was in Korea, not Korea. Some of the boys that I knew, I think, flew in Korea. Right. And I think the memorial that had the most effect on me that I've seen, the Vietnam Wall is heartbreaking, but the Korean memorial just tore me to pieces. I walked out of there crying.
Did you?
Because not sobbing, but with tears. But it just tore me up. It's the most realistic thing I've ever seen.
I've visited it too, and I'm sure you've had an opportunity to walk all along the mall in Washington. Right. And you would agree it's very, very important that we show respect for those that came before us and paid the ultimate price.
It is. And one thing I wish I could do, and I have I don't have the vitality to do it, working 40 hours a week. I get tired. But I would love to work at a VA hospital again. And I do contribute to the veterans organizations. That's one thing I will spend money on that isn't a necessity. I mean, a necessity for me.
Right.
But to me, it's important that everybody remember these people, and not only the ones who have lost their lives, but the ones who have lost limbs, lost the ability to support their families, and for their families. Because boys miss having a father who's able to get out and play with them. Wives miss a husband who is not always all there. And I have great sympathy for the wives of all of the people in the military, but also for our firemen and our policemen, many of whom give their lives for us.
You are absolutely correct, and you're touching upon some of the elements of our life and culture in this country that we should never take for granted, and that's why we give thanks for those that step forward to defend our way of life.
I hope that the Guard is doing something about seeing that more people know more about them, because I know people who don't even realize what the National Guard does or that they are active. They sort of think of them as something that only gets called up in an emergency, and they forget that in order to be any good then, they've been training all the time.
That's true. The training involved, and now just simply in the era that we live in, that most any member that joins the National Guard expects to, and their family expects, that they will be called up, deployed, and have numerous opportunities to serve full time. And so, but you're right, that message needs to be shared with people.
I think so, because look what they did. They get called on for things like Haiti's earthquake and Katrina.
Correct.
And people forget about that.
True.
And they don't think how much discipline it takes, and you don't learn discipline in an ordinary life. Most of the people I know are pretty much undisciplined.
Well, we know that's not the case with you, Mose. We admire your recollection, your contributing to the community now, and the fact that you indeed appreciate the military, and that you support the National Guard. And I thank you personally for that.
Well, I do. I think it's wonderful.
And so, Mrs. Virginia Pounds, I'm going to give you an opportunity to close this in case there's anything that you left out or anything that you want to leave us with on a positive note. The floor is yours.
I don't think I left out anything. If I did, it's up because of my memory. But I do hope that you are doing something about seeing that the Guard gets the recognition they should have. I think it's very important.
Well, we appreciate your sentiments. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.